What if I told you that um, participating in a modern Western democracy, like voting in an election, campaigning for someone, or just agreeing that the majority should rule, is actually classified by an ancient civilizational blueprint as a direct violation of divine law?
I mean, it is a genuinely jarring premise, right? Because we're just so thoroughly conditioned to view majority rule as the ultimate pinnacle of human freedom.
Exactly.
So the very idea of categorizing democracy as a form of subjugation, well, it feels almost offensive to modern ears.
It feels completely counterintuitive. But today we are pointing our lens at a massive,
Yeah.
really highly detailed body of work that makes exactly that claim.
Yeah, and it's a deep one today.
We have this stack of translated notes and this incredibly dense, thought-provoking Urdu lecture by the rationalist scholar Allama G.A. Parwez. And the entire focus of this material, the absolute center of gravity for a deep dive today, is literally just a single verse from the Quran.
Right, Surah Al-Imran, verse 151.
Yeah. And to you listening, welcome to the deep dive. We're getting right into it because the reason we are analyzing Parwez's rationalist framework is because it demands a total paradigm shift from you.
It really does. Because when most people approach ancient religious texts, they bring a very highly specific, inherited set of expectations with them.
Right. They look for theology or moral comfort.
Exactly. They want mystical elevation or maybe just, a checklist of personal, private rituals to secure a good spot in the afterlife.
And the sources identify that exact expectation and immediately call it out. They call it the ritual trap.
The ritual trap. Yeah, it's such a perfect term for it.
Like, why do so many people across so many cultures recite these ancient texts purely to seek spiritual blessings? They memorize the phonetic sounds, they chant them. They basically treat the text as a kind of mystical incantation to ward off bad luck.
Right, and Parwez's argument is that by doing this, humanity has taken a really rigorous, uncompromising civilizational blueprint and just, reduced it to a mere religious placeholder.
I was thinking about this, and it's kind of like, imagine finding the complex engineering schematics for a cold fusion reactor, right?
Okay, I like where this is going.
And you decide the lines look really pretty, so you just frame it on your wall as abstract art, completely ignoring the fact that it contains the literal instructions to generate limitless energy and restructure the global economy.
That framing is so essential for the journey we are about to take today, because we are actively leaving the realm of the purely metaphysical.
We really are.
We're entering the realm of political science, of constitutional law, and socioeconomic justice. The text argues that this verse 151, it isn't a mystical warning about supernatural wrath.
Nope.
It's actually a brilliant sequential diagnosis of how societies collapse when they build their legal frameworks on a fundamentally flawed premise.
And that is the mission for this deep dive. We're taking that schematic down from the wall, and we're going to read it like engineers today.
Absolutely.
But to do that, to actually read a constitutional document, you can't rely on mystical definitions.
Right. If you read a modern legal contract and interpret the word liability to mean, like, bad karma, you are going to end up in prison.
Yeah, that's not going to hold up in court. You have to know the precise technical legal definitions.
And what's fascinating here is that the source material spends a massive amount of time returning to the original rational root definitions of key Arabic terms.
Yeah, he really tears down the traditional glossary.
He does. The author makes this really compelling historical argument that centuries of traditional monarchical interpretation have softened these words, basically deliberately stripping them of their revolutionary socioeconomic power.
So let's put that to the test right now. Let's look at the glossary provided in the notes and compare the traditional theological definitions with Parwez's systemic definitions.
I think this alone fundamentally alters the landscape of the text for anyone listening.
It totally does. So let's start with arguably the heaviest term in the entire lexicon, which is shirk.
Oh, yeah. Shirk.
Right. If you ask someone on the street or pick up a standard translation, the traditional view of shirk is basically ritualistic idol worship.
Right, bowing down to a statue made of wood or stone, or praying to a sun god. Polytheism in the most ancient, literal sense.
Yeah, but Parwez's rationalist methodology completely dismantles that limitation. Functionally, systemically, the text defines shirk as obeying the laws, commands, or socioeconomic systems formulated by human beings alongside or instead of the divine laws.
It's a massive leap.
It is. So walk me through the jurisprudence of that. How do we leap from carving a wooden idol to obeying a human-made legal code? Because those seem like two entirely different categories of human behavior to me.
Well, the connection lies in the core concept of absolute sovereignty. Like, why did ancient people bow to idols in the first place?
Because they thought the idols controlled the rain or the harvest.
Yeah. Exactly. They believed those entities held power over their sustenance, their safety, their future. They submitted their autonomy to them.
Okay, I'm tracking with you.
So in this new paradigm, the divine constitution, the Quran, represents a set of objective, unchangeable constants for human behavior and societal structure.
Right, like an operating system.
Exactly like an operating system. It's flawless, objective code. So to commit shirk is to take the subjective, flawed, shifting opinions of a human being, whether that's a king, a dictator, a parliament, or a cleric, and elevate those human opinions to the level of ultimate, unquestionable law.
Okay, sticking with the tech analogy, it's like taking this flawless objective operating system, which is divine law, and then downloading a subjective, buggy, human-made patch.
Yes.
And the moment you mix them, the system degrades. By obeying a human law, you are basically treating that human lawmaker as a deity. You're granting them the sovereign authority that belongs exclusively to the objective constants.
Precisely. Mixing human-made fundamental legislation with the objective constants of the Quran is the very essence of shirk. It is an act of systemic corruption. And the reason the text frames it as the ultimate societal sin is because of what it does to human dignity. When one human being is forced to bow to the intellect, authority, or legislation of another human being, they are elevating a fellow human to the status of a sovereign master.
Okay, I want to challenge this early on, because the immediate modern defense is that human lawmaking is just necessary for progress, right? We don't live in the 7th century anymore.
Yeah.
So if Parwez defines shirk as obeying human-made systems, how does he square that with the absolute necessity of civil ordinances? I mean, the Quran doesn't have a chapter on regulating artificial intelligence or managing air traffic control or setting interest rates for a central bank.
Right, of course not.
So if humans can't make laws, doesn't the society just paralyze?
That is a critical distinction to make, and it's a great question. The sources address this by basically dividing the concept of law into two distinct categories.
Okay.
You have the immutable constitutional constants on one side, and then the adaptable administrative bylaws on the other.
The permanent versus the flexible.
Exactly. The divine law provides the absolute hudud, the boundary lines, or the permanent values. For example, a permanent constitutional constant might be that wealth cannot circulate only among the rich. It must nourish the entire society.
Okay, so that is an unchangeable objective.
Right. But how a society achieves that in the 7th century versus the 21st century, that requires human intellect, science, and administrative planning.
Oh, I see. So the administration adapts, but the destination never changes.
Yes. The shirk occurs when humans attempt to alter the fundamental constants.
So, like, when a human parliament decides to write a law that legally permits the hoarding of capital at the expense of the working class, they violated the permanent value.
Exactly. They have stepped out of the role of an administrator and assumed the role of a sovereign lawgiver. They are rewriting the operating system rather than just updating the software applications.
That reframing of shirk changes the entire gravity of the text. It means that idolatry isn't just an archaic practice of the past, it is the active, ongoing political reality of almost every modern nation state.
It really is. Which brings us to the next term in the glossary, which is inextricably linked to this whole concept, and that is ibadat, or abdiyat.
Right. Traditionally, this is translated merely as worship or prayer. When you hear ibadat, you picture the physical act of kneeling, fasting, or performing a religious rite.
But systemically, within this socioeconomic framework, the root word abad means someone who has surrendered their own will to follow the will of another.
Okay.
Therefore, ibadat signifies absolute obedience and subservience to a specific system or law. To become an abda, a servant or slave to someone, means to become subjugated to their commands and their socioeconomic frameworks.
And Parwez connects this directly back to the economic realities of a society, doesn't he?
Yes, yeah.
Like, it's not just about who you direct your prayers toward in the privacy of your home. It's about whose economy you are participating in, whose rules dictate your livelihood, who has the power to define the value of your labor.
The text points out that the Quran explicitly forbids individuals from adopting the abdiyah of anyone other than the divine. It states categorically that no human has the right to demand obedience from another human.
That's a huge statement. No human has the right to demand obedience from another.
Right. So true freedom in this blueprint is achieved only through exclusive obedience to the universal divine constitution.
Because if you are subservient to an objective, non-human law that treats everyone equally, you are structurally liberated from being the slave of dictatorial regimes, or clergy, or even parliamentary majorities. You are subservient to the law, not to any man.
Exactly. And the lecture notes also touch upon how this redefines other common terms like salat and sabar.
Right, because if ibadat is systemic obedience, then salat isn't just a ritualistic prayer 5 times a day.
What does he define it as?
Well, the sources say it is the active collective establishment of this divine socioeconomic roadmap. And sabar isn't just patiently suffering through hardship like we usually think.
Oh, right. It's the steadfast, unyielding commitment to maintaining that system even when it is under threat.
Yeah, the entire vocabulary transforms from passive mysticism into active statecraft. So, imagine how your view of the world changes when you realize worship actually means political and economic obedience.
This systemic lexicon inevitably raises a profound question about authority, though.
How so?
Well, if human intellect is inherently flawed and subjective, and we cannot use it to establish fundamental constitutional laws, what is the standard for proving a law is actually valid?
Okay. That brings us to the third crucial term in the linguistic key, which is sultan.
Sultan. This one is fascinating because the historical baggage attached to the word sultan is just massive.
It really is. We hear it and immediately think of a monarch, an emperor, a guy with a fancy hat and a massive army.
Right. We equate it with worldly dominion and physical coercive dominance.
But linguistically and rationally within this framework, sultan means something entirely different. The notes say it refers to an irrefutable, divinely revealed proof or objective argument. In Arabic, a dale will.
Wait, so a society built on an argument rather than an army?
Yes.
How does a modern state actually run on this? Because every state in history has ultimately relied on the monopoly of violence to enforce its laws.
Well, the argument here is about the justification of the law, not merely the enforcement of it. In the administration of the Deen, the socioeconomic order, you cannot legitimize a mandate through sheer brute force, dictatorial whim, or even the coercive power of a voting majority.
So it has to be proven.
Exactly. Every single fundamental policy must be backed by sultan. It must have an explicit, objective rationale sanctioned by the divine constitution.
But I see a massive loophole here.
Lay it on me.
If human intellect is required to interpret the divine constitution and apply the sultan, aren't the humans in charge of interpreting the text just going to impose their own subjective interpretation?
Like they always do.
Yeah. How is a council of scholars interpreting the text any different from a dictatorship or a theocracy? They are still humans claiming their interpretation is the ultimate law.
That is the exact trap that Parwez spent his life dismantling, actually. The rationalist approach argues that the Quranic text must be interpreted according to its internal linguistic consistency and its overarching objective, which is universal human nourishment and absolute equality.
Okay, so there's a metric.
Yes. If an interpretation leads to the subjugation of one group by another, or the hoarding of wealth by an elite class, that interpretation is objectively false because it violates the permanent values of the text itself.
Oh, wow. So the sultan isn't a blank check for scholars.
Not at all. It is a rigid, almost mathematical proof. If a scholar claims a law is divine, but that law creates a hierarchy of masters and slaves, the society has the intellectual duty to reject it.
It acts like an immune system against clerical tyranny. The text itself provides the metric to judge the humans trying to enforce it.
Exactly. So if we synthesize this linguistic key for you, the listener, your perspective should be completely inverted by now.
Right, because shirk is no longer carving a wooden idol. It is obeying subjective human legislation.
And ibadat is no longer just chanting prayers. It is absolute political and economic obedience to a system.
And a sultan is not a king with a sword. It is an irrefutable, objective proof.
It is a profound recalibration of thought. You cannot build the architecture of a perfectly equal society if your foundational vocabulary is rooted in subservience to kings and mystics.
And if human equality is fundamentally destroyed by human legislation, well, that forces us to look at the actual architecture required to maintain that equality.
Which brings us to the next massive concept in the text. The sources refer to this as Makami and Saniyat, the exalted station of human dignity.
Right. And the core premise here is that every single human being is born with absolute equality. No human inherently possesses the right to rule over another. If shirk is systemic subjugation, one human bowing to the laws of another, then avoiding shirk is the only structural way to create a radically equal society.
Okay, let's test that logic against our current global standard for equality. I introduced the deep dive by claiming that even modern Western democracy is considered a violation in this framework.
Yeah, that was a bold hook.
I think most people listening would agree that a military junta forcing everyone to obey arbitrary laws is subjugation, obviously. But democracy, we all vote, we debate, we reach a consensus, and the majority rules.
Yeah.
Isn't that the most ethical system human intellect has ever produced?
Well, Parwez's analysis is highly provocative, specifically because it challenges those exact Enlightenment ideals we hold so dear. The sources draw a very strict, uncompromising line here.
What's the line?
A democratic model where 51% of the people impose their subjective intellect on the remaining 49% is still classified as a form of shirk.
Wow.
It is systemic humiliation because it still creates a hierarchy of masters of the majority and slaves the minority.
But if not democracy, then what? The tyranny of the minority. How does Parwez avoid the obvious alternative, which is autocracy?
He avoids it by removing human sovereignty entirely. The critique of democracy in this framework is that it just rotates who gets to play the master. The 51% dictate the laws, the taxes, the social norms, and the 49% are forced into subjugation by the threat of state violence.
I see.
Parwez argues that true equality dictates that all humans are absolutely equal, and the only way to maintain this equality is if everyone, the majority and the minority, submits exclusively to an objective, higher, non-human authority.
The unchanging values.
Exactly.
So if a society operates under a system where humans legislate for other humans, even democratically, it inevitably creates a socioeconomic hierarchy. The relationship between the individual and the state must be mediated entirely by the objective constants of the Quran to protect the individual from the tyranny of human subjectivism.
And there's a deeply illuminating analogy in the source material that perfectly captures the psychological toll of human sovereignty.
Oh, the 10 Masters analogy. I enthusiastically want to share this one because it stood out to me as one of the most relatable concepts in the entire lecture.
It really is. The author asks us to consider a servant, basically an employee, who is trying to appease 10 different masters simultaneously with conflicting moods, agendas, and demands.
Yes. If you extrapolate the 10 Masters to a modern context, it explains so much of our current societal exhaustion. Think about working for 10 different bosses today.
Sounds like a nightmare.
Right. Boss number 1 wants you to maximize quarterly profits at all costs. Boss number 2 is a regulatory body demanding strict environmental compliance. Boss 3 is the algorithm of public opinion that will cancel you if you say the wrong thing. Boss 4 is inflation, silently eating away your savings.
That's incredibly accurate.
As the servant, your entire existence is a state of perpetual anxiety and ideological confusion. You are constantly shifting, compromising your integrity, trying to balance these competing, volatile human demands.
Yeah, and in this framework, those 10 masters represent the shifting, volatile opinions of human lawmakers, political factions, economic markets, and societal expectations.
Basically, the noise of human rule.
Exactly. When you are governed by human systems, you are the servant with 10 masters. You are beholden to the whims of the economy, the current political administration, lobbying groups, and cultural trends. Your security is entirely dependent on forces that have no objective moral center.
The contrast, then, is a servant who has only one master. One objective, unchanging master whose rules are universally fair, clearly laid out, and never alter based on profit margins or election cycles.
And that one master represents the singular, unchanging divine law. And this brings us to the true meaning of tawhid, or monotheism, within the systemic context.
Which is what, exactly, systemically speaking?
It is not just a theological declaration that there is only one God in the heavens. It is the radical political declaration that there can only be one universal law on earth. This singular obedience liberates the human soul from mental slavery. It frees you from the exhausting, degrading process of trying to appease the human masters of society.
It is a paradox, really. It's the ultimate centralization of authority, submitting entirely to this divine constitution that guarantees the maximum decentralization of freedom.
That's a great way to put it.
Because if the fundamental law is fixed at the very top by a non-human entity, that every human below that is exactly irrevocably equal. No one can pull rank on you. No one can say, I wrote the law, therefore I am your superior.
Which naturally brings us to a crucial theological concept that Parwez masterfully applies to political science, the finality of prophethood.
Wait, how does a theological belief about prophets factor into the political architecture of a state?
Okay, so in Islamic theology, it is an accepted tenet that direct divine revelation ended with the final prophet.
Right, the seal of the prophet.
Yes. And Parwez takes this theological belief and extracts a profound systemic implication. Because direct revelation is permanently closed, no modern human being, whether they are a prime minister, a king, a supreme leader, or a highly venerated clergy member, can ever claim to have divine authority or a direct pipeline to God's will.
Oh, that is a massive safeguard.
Huge!
It permanently closes the door on anyone claiming a divine mandate for their subjective personal opinions. Nobody can stand up in Parliament and say, God told me we need to invade our neighbor, or God told me we need to raise taxes on the working class.
Exactly. The finality of prophethood democratizes the intellect while maintaining the supremacy of the Constitution. The Quran remains the sole preserved objective source. This completely wipes out clerical authority and personality worship.
So no religious figure can dictate laws either.
No. If a religious leader or politician tells you to do something, and they cannot provide explicit, sultan, irrefutable proof directly rooted in the text, then obeying them is an act of shirk. The text protects the society from being hijacked by charismatic individuals using religion as a cloak for personal power.
It makes the society immune to cults of personality. But the theory is only as good as its execution, right? This forces us to ask the practical question.
Which is?
Who actually runs the economy? How do you build roads, collect taxes, and distribute resources if you can't write new laws?
Right.
Which transitions us into the absolute core of the deep dive of the economic engine that Parwez calls Nizami Rububiyat.
Nizami Rububiyat translates roughly to the system of universal sustenance, or the system of providence. To understand how a society functions without human legislation, we have to completely redefine the role of the state.
Okay, let's redefine it.
In this framework, the central authority, which is referred to as the Markaz, is not a sovereign legislative body like a modern Congress or Parliament.
So the Markaz does not create laws. What exactly does it do all day?
The Markaz is purely an administrative agency. Its sole constitutional mandate is to implement and administer the unchanging constants of the divine constitution in real time.
Okay, can you give an example of how that actually works?
Sure. Let's take the economic constant we mentioned earlier. The Quran explicitly states that wealth must not circulate solely among the rich. That is the permanent life. The Markaz cannot debate whether or not to enforce this.
They can't vote to just let the rich get richer.
Exactly. Their only job is to figure out how to enforce it given the current technological and societal conditions.
Let's drill down into that, because I'm sure you listening are wondering how an ancient text regulates a modern global economy. If a Markaz is just an administrator, how does it handle really complex issues like corporate monopolies, fiat currency, or global trade?
Well, the Markaz utilizes a system of shura, or mutual consultation. They utilize the best human intellect, science, and economic data available to them.
So they do use experts.
Yes, but, and this is the critical distinction, this consultation occurs strictly within the boundaries of the permanent values. If economists propose a fiat currency system, the Markaz must test that system against the objective constants.
Like running it through a filter.
Exactly. Does this fiat system inherently cause inflation that harms the poor while enriching the asset-holding class? If the answer is yes, the system is rejected. Not because a politician voted against it, but because it objectively violates the constitutional constant of universal sustenance.
It functions almost like an extreme version of a Supreme Court, but rather than interpreting vague, centuries-old human amendments, they're applying immutable mathematical-like constants to real-world economics.
That's a great comparison.
Because the fundamental laws are unchangeable, economic policies cannot be skewed to favor elite factions. They cannot be manipulated by lobbying groups to serve the temporary political interests of a ruling party. So imagine living in a society where your economic security isn't tied to which political party won the last election.
The overarching goal of Nizami Rububiyat is universal nourishment. It is an economic engine designed with the singular, unyielding purpose of ensuring that no citizen is left behind physically, intellectually, or socially.
It eradicates exploitation at the root.
Yes, because no human being possesses the legislative authority to write a law that gives them an unfair structural advantage over another human being.
Parwez contrasts this system quite aggressively against the dominant economic models of the 20th century too, doesn't he? Like capitalism and communism.
He does. He argues that both of those human-made systems inherently lead to subjugation, just in different flavors.
How so?
Well, capitalism might maximize production and innovation, but its foundational premise is the maximization of individual capital, which mathematically guarantees massive wealth gaps, exploitation, and the eventual control of the state by the wealthy elite.
Right, and communism.
Communism, on the other hand, recognizes the exploitation of capitalism and attempts to enforce equality, but it relies on a centrally planned human economy. It replaces the tyranny of the corporate elite with the absolute authoritarian subjugation of the state apparatus.
Oh, man. So you trade the corporate master for the bureaucratic master, but you are still a servant to human intellect.
Exactly. The Nizam-e-Rubaiyat bypasses both by establishing permanent socioeconomic structures designed solely for universal sustenance. The state does not own the individual, and the individual cannot exploit the state. The state exists merely as a conduit to nourish the collective, the millat.
It is the ultimate guarantee of human rights taken to its absolute logical extreme. Like, we currently agree, in theory, on certain unalienable rights, freedom of speech, the right to a fair trial. We say those are untouchable by politicians.
Right.
But this framework says that economic justice, access to resources, and absolute social equality are also untouchable constants. The government is just the janitor keeping the building clean, basically. It doesn't get to redesign the architecture or evict the tenants.
That's spot on. But what happens when a society refuses to accept this blueprint?
That's the big question.
What happens when humanity decides its own subjective intellect is superior and attempts to patch together human desires with these divine constants?
This is where the diagnostic aspect of the text comes in.
Yeah.
We move into the social physics of the framework, the concept of cause and effect. The lecture notes refer to this as the law of requital, or in Urdu, mukafat-i-amal.
And this requires perhaps the most profound mindset shift of all for the listener. When we read the opening text of Surah Al-Imran, verse 151, it states, "We will cast terror into the hearts of those who disbelieve for what they have associated with Allah."
Right.
The traditional Orthodox reading of that verse is entirely anthropomorphic. It imagines God as a reactionary emotional king sitting on a throne. If you sin, God gets angry and actively punishes you by throwing a lightning bolt of fear into your heart.
It's a very medieval concept of divine retribution, just, anger and smiting.
Yeah.
But Parwez's rationalist framework entirely rejects that view, right?
Completely. In this system, mukafat-i-amal operates exactly like the laws of physics. It is a scientific, unavoidable mathematical consequence of social conduct.
And the analogy in the source material for this is perfect. It's exactly like the laws of nature. If you put your bare hand into a blazing fire, you get burned.
Simple cause and effect.
Yeah. The fire isn't angry at you. It doesn't have a vendetta. The universe isn't punishing you for being a morally bad person. The burn is just the natural, logical, and unavoidable consequence of violating the physical parameters of human flesh and extreme heat.
And just as there are physical laws governing the natural world, Parwez argues that the Quran outlines objective socioeconomic laws governing human societies.
So verse 151 is diagnosing something specific.
Yes. It is diagnosing a specific psychological and societal disease that organically manifests when those socioeconomic laws are broken. The text calls this disease rube.
Rube, which translates to terror, but not in the sense of a sudden jump scare, right?
No, it's a systemic terror. A deep, chronic insecurity, profound societal cowardice, the loss of a civilization's boldness and courage. The author argues that rube is the natural, unavoidable consequence of legislative shirk.
Let's trace the mechanics of why that happens, because it's fascinating. Why does obeying human-made laws naturally result in societal terror?
Well, because human laws are inherently unstable. They are entirely dependent on the shifting interests of majorities, the whims of dictators, or the volatile trends of the global market.
They change all the time.
Exactly. When citizens live under a system where the foundational laws regarding their property, their rights, and their livelihood can be changed tomorrow by 51% of the population, they are structurally stripped of objective stability.
They lose their center of gravity. They are living on a tectonic fault line, just waiting for the earthquake of a new election or a market crash.
They live in a perpetual state of rube. They constantly fear changing regimes, they fear economic exploitation, they fear that a new law will bankrupt their industry, or that a new administration will strip away their civil liberties.
That sounds exhausting.
It is. A society governed by subjective human intellect alone loses its fearlessness because the ground beneath its feet is constantly moving. You cannot be bold or courageous when your entire socioeconomic survival depends on appeasing the 10 masters.
This resonates so deeply with the modern condition. If you look at the anxiety epidemics in modern populations, the chronic insecurity, the baseline hum of dread that seems to permeate modern life, we often blame it on social media, or the fast pace of technology, or the 24-hour news cycle.
But Parwez's analysis suggests the anxiety is actually systemic.
Yeah, it's baked into the very architecture of how we govern ourselves. We're anxious because we know, deep down, that our security is arbitrary. It can be voted away. It can be legislated out of existence by people we have never even met.
The sources use a strikingly vivid, almost haunting visual metaphor to describe a society that commits this systemic shirk. It states that a civilization that abandons the unchangeable constants of divine law is like a bird that has been cast out of its nest, falling from the sky.
The mechanics of that metaphor are brilliant. The bird is in free fall, and because it has no solid foundation to land on, it faces two inevitable fates.
Right. What's the first one?
The first is that it is snatched out of the air by predators. In a geopolitical context, this represents foreign subjugation, a society weakened by internal legislative shifting, divided by human factions fighting for control. Well, it becomes easy prey for more powerful predatory nations to economically dominate or colonize them.
And if the falling bird somehow avoids the predators, it faces the second fate. It is blown aimlessly by shifting winds. It has no agency, no direction, no solid ground. It is battered by global economic chaos, political polarization, and societal decay until it inevitably crashes.
That is the natural consequence, the mukafadi amal, of abandoning the objective anchor of the divine constitution.
Which brings us to the ultimate conclusion of verse 151. And this introduces two more profound, heavy concepts into our lexicon: zulm and nar.
Right, the verse ends by saying, "And their refuge will be the fire," which is nar, "and wretched is the residence of the wrongdoers," the zalimin.
So let's apply the rationalist methodology to redefine those terms as well. The wrongdoers, the zalimin, are those who commit zulm. Traditionally, zulm is translated simply as cruelty, oppression, or tyranny.
But linguistically, there's more to it.
Much more. The root meaning is much more precise. It means to displace something. It is the act of failing to keep a thing in its rightful designated place.
Displacing something, like taking a crucial gear out of a clockwork mechanism and just shoving it somewhere it doesn't belong, or taking a king off a chessboard and replacing it with a pawn.
Exactly. In the context of makom insaniat, human dignity, treating a human being as a subordinate to another human being displaces them from their cosmic equilibrium.
It knocks them out of their proper place.
Yes. It takes a creature that was designed to be an autonomous, dignified ruler of the physical universe, subservient only to objective universal laws, and degrades them into a subjugated slave of another human's intellect. The implementation of subjective human law is the absolute pinnacle of zulm because it displaces human dignity itself.
And the unavoidable scientific consequence of that displacement is nar, the fire.
But again, we must strip away the mythological interpretations here.
No lakes of fire under the earth.
In this rationalist framework, no. Nar does not represent a mystical subterranean fire in the afterlife. It represents a hellish state of societal chaos, worldly humiliation, and structural destruction right here on Earth. When a system attempts to mix human laws with the divine constants, the result isn't a neat, pragmatic compromise. The result is the fire.
You can look at human history and see the smoke from those fires everywhere. Like, the French Revolution was a fire caused by the extreme zulm of the aristocracy, displacing the dignity of the peasantry. The world wars were fires fueled by the zulm of hypernationalism and imperial human expansion. And the modern, slow-burning fire of extreme wealth inequality, where the masses struggle to afford basic shelter while the lawmakers and corporate monopolies thrive. That is nar.
It's the friction of the societal machine tearing itself apart because the wrong gears were installed. Surah Al-Imran, verse 151, when read through this systemic lens, is diagnosing the friction that causes the fire.
Let's pull all of these threads together. We've gone deep into the linguistic roots, dismantling centuries of monarchical vocabulary. We've examined the political architecture of human equality, the economic engine of the Markaz, and the inescapable social physics of the law of requital.
It's been a massive journey.
It has. So if we synthesize this entire lecture, what is the permanent value, the Mustaqil Qadar, that we extract from this deep dive?
The massive paradigm shift is realizing that this text is a constitutional mandate for absolute human freedom. It establishes beyond a shadow of a doubt that a fearless, stable, and truly just society cannot be built on the shifting sands of human opinion.
True security, the total eradication of that chronic societal anxiety that Rukib, can only be achieved when society aligns its socioeconomic engine with unchangeable, universal constants.
Right. It demands the total, uncompromising eradication of all forms of human-over-human dictation. No kings, no dictatorial clergy, no corporate oligarchs, and yes, no tyranny of the majority either.
It is an incredibly radical, almost utopian vision of human equality. It argues that until we submit to an objective law that no human can alter, we will always be caught in a cyclical, exhausting loop of subjugation, rebellion, and fire.
So, to you, the listener, what does this all mean? You now hold the theoretical blueprint for a perfectly equal, fearless civilization, a society that functions like a flawless operating system, providing universal sustenance without exploitation. You understand the structural truth behind the rituals.
But, theories are pristine. Blueprints look perfect when they're laid out on a drafting table in a quiet room.
They do.
Theories are easy until they hit the battlefield of reality, until they are challenged by human greed, by resource scarcity, by geopolitical threats, and the sheer friction of human existence.
And the author of our sources, Allama G.A. Parwez, is acutely aware of this.
Yeah.
Because he ends this entire lecture by pointing directly to the very next verse in the Quran, verse 152.
And verse 152 pivots away from theory and plunges directly into a very specific, incredibly violent historical event, the Battle of Uhud.
Right. That is where theory becomes history, where the constitutional mandate is tested not in a lecture hall, but in blood and chaos.
Exactly. So the question we're left with is this. How does a society actually maintain this fearless, unshakable system, this Nizami Rubiyat, when its very physical survival is violently threatened by outside forces?
When the predators we talked about earlier are diving in for the kill.
Can this beautifully designed economic and social engine survive the ultimate stress test of war and existential threat?
That is the question you will have to ponder before our next deep dive. Think about the systemic definitions we uncovered today. Look at the structures of power around you and ask yourself who is writing the laws and whose economy you are truly serving.
Until next time, keep questioning the definitions you've been handed, and we'll see you as we take this civilizational blueprint directly onto the battlefield.